Hey everyone, this is a piece, this is an entry in the book A Libertarian Reader, 160 Years of Fighting for Freedom, edited by Ian MacKay, not Ian Mackay. The back of the book says, Libertarian was first coined in 1857 to summarize opposition to the authoritarian relations generated by the state, capitalism, and patriarchy and the desire to end them. This anthology brings together libertarian writings from the next 160 years, all united by a love of freedom and seeking to change the world to allow every individual to flourish. Articles by thinkers and activists from all libertarian schools are included: anarchist, council communist, situationist, autonomist, guild socialist, and revolutionary syndicalists raise their voices in fighting for freedom. These writings will aid today's struggles against every hierarchy, whether political, economic, or social, and bring a free socialist society closer. This entry is a entry from, I believe it's from Ante Ciliga's The Russian Question, but maybe not. I don't know. But do you plan to read, not The Russian Question, The Russian Enigma? I do plan to read that book eventually. Now that I'm looking at it, it looks like it might not actually be from that book. But we'll see. But it's titled, the entry's titled, The Kronstadt Uprising and the Fate of the Russian Revolution by Ante Ciliga. This is from La Révolution Prolétarienne, which I think was kind of like a, not sure, but I think it might have been like a radical left syndicalist journal. I think, like, I'm not sure if it was only Ciliga who wrote in it, but it might have also been, like, I think Boris Souverin. I mean, Ante Ciliga and Boris Souverin both went in right-wing directions. I think Boris Souverin became kind of like a liberal cold warrior, and then Ante Ciliga became, I think, after, spending like 5 years in a Stalinist jail and then trying to, debate Trotsky on the extent of the degeneration of the Russian Revolution, he eventually succumbed to, I can't remember what nationalism. I think he might have been Croatian. I think Ciliga's Croatian. Is it Ustaše? That's Croatian. It was like the Croatian fascist. I think he became like a pretty far right figure participating in that kind of thing. I'm not sure though. I might be saying the wrong place, the wrong country, but he definitely got involved with some kind of like fascist nationalist politics after being a communist. Anyway, the introduction to the piece by the editor says, Ciliga's account of the Kronstadt revolt of 1921 addresses the fundamental issues expressed by it and indicates the lessons to be drawn from it. It was translated into English and appeared in War Commentary in January 1942 before being issued as a pamphlet the following month. This translation comes from, I guess, a standalone book by Anton Ciliga titled The Kronstadt Revolt, which was released by Freedom Press, which was the press, I think it was in England, the famous anarchist communist press. I believe it's anarchist communist, but it's the because it has its heritage in Kropotkin's time in England. Alright, here we go. The correspondence between Trotsky and Wendelin Thomas, one of the leaders of the revolt in the German Navy in 1918, and a member of the American Committee of Inquiry into the Moscow trials, regarding the historical significance of the events in Kronstadt in 1921, has given rise to widespread international discussion. That in itself indicates the importance of the problem. On the other hand, it is no accident that the special interest should be shown in the Kronstadt revolt today, that there is an analogy, A direct link even between what happened at Kronstadt 17 years ago and the recent trials at Moscow is only too apparent. I have a piece on this channel by Alexei Gusev, who was a labor historian at Moscow State University, who operated like some kind of like radical left library called like the Victor Serge Library or something like that in Moscow. I don't know what they're doing now, but basically it's about like conceptualizing the Kronstadt revolt as a third revolution, and he basically says the same thing, that there's like very much a correspondence between, or some kind of similarity between the way that the Kronstadt revolt was handled and the fate of those who handled it, right? So two key figures that were involved in the suppression of the Kronstadt revolt were Trotsky and Zinoviev, who were later, Trotsky was assassinated, Zinoviev was purged, and they came together as the joint opposition in the late 1920s. I think it's like 26 or 27, something like that. Yeah, I think it's 27. And they were both responsible for the repression of Kronstadt and repression of strikes and worker unrest in Petrograd in 1921. And they both met a swift end by the state that they helped initiate, and the general political culture of extreme violence towards political opponents. Anyway, today we witness the murder of the leaders of the Russian Revolution. In 1921, it was the masses who formed the basis of the revolution who were massacred. Would it be possible today to disgrace and to suppress the leaders of October without the slightest protest from the people, if these leaders had not already by armed force silenced the Kronstadt sailors and the workers all over Russia? Trotsky's reply to Wendell and Thomas shows that, unfortunately, Trotsky, who is, together with Stalin, only one of the leaders of the October Revolution concerned in the suppression of Kronstadt, who remains alive, still refuses to look at the past objectively. Furthermore, in his article, Hue and Cry over Kronstadt, Trotsky increases the gulf which he created at that time between the working masses and himself. He does not hesitate, after having ordered their bombardment in 1921, to describe these men today as, quote, completely demoralized elements, men who wore elegant, wide trousers and did their hair like pimps, end quote. No, it's not with accusations of this kind, which reek of bureaucratic arrogance, that a useful contribution can be made to the lessons of the Great Russian Revolution. In order to assess the influence that Kronstadt has had on the outcome of the revolution, it is necessary to avoid all personal issues and direct attention to three fundamental questions. 1. In what general circumstances the Kronstadt revolt arose? 2. What were the aims of the movement? 3. By what means did the insurgents attempt to achieve these aims? The masses and the bureaucracy in 1920-21. Everyone now agrees that during the winter of 1920-21, the Russian Revolution was passing through an extremely critical phase. The offensive against Poland had ended in defeat at Warsaw. The social revolution had not broken out in the West. The Russian Revolution had become isolated. Famine and disorganization had seized the entire country. The peril of bourgeois restoration knocked at the door of the revolution. At this moment of crisis, the different classes and parties which existed within the revolutionary camp each presented their solution for its resolution. The Soviet government and the higher circles in the Communist Party applied their own solution of increasing the power of the bureaucracy. The attribution of powers to the, quote, executive committees, end quote, which had hitherto been vested in the Soviets, the replacement of the dictatorship of the class by the dictatorship of the party, the shift of authority even within the party from its members to its cadres, the replacement of the double power of the bureaucracy and the workers in the factory by the sole power of the bureaucracy. To do all this was to, quote, save the revolution, end quote. It was at this moment that Bukharin put forward his plea for a, quote, proletarian Bonapartism, end quote. By placing restrictions on itself, the proletariat would, according to him, facilitate the struggle against the bourgeois counter-revolution. Here was manifested already the enormous quasi-messianic self-importance of the communist bureaucracy. The 9th and 10th Congress of the Communist Party, as well as the intervening year, passed beneath the auspices of this new policy. Lenin rigidly carried it through. Trotsky sang its praises. The bureaucracy prevented the bourgeois restoration by eliminating the proletarian character of the revolution. The formation of the, quote, workers' opposition, end quote, within the party, which was supported not only by the proletarian faction in the party itself, but also by the great mass of unorganized workers, the general strike of the Petrograd workers a short time before the Kronstadt revolt, and finally the insurrection itself, all expressed the aspirations of the masses who felt, more or less clearly, that a, quote, third party, end quote, was about to destroy their conquests. The movement of poor peasants led by Makhno in the Ukraine was the outcome of similar resistance in similar circumstances. In the struggle of 1920 to 1921 are examined in light of the historical material now available. One is struck by the way that these scattered masses, starved and enfeebled by economic disorganization, nevertheless had the strength to formulate for themselves with such precision their social and political position, and at the same time to defend themselves against the bureaucracy and against the bourgeoisie. New section. The Kronstadt Program. We shall not content ourselves, like Trotsky, with simple declarations, so we submit to readers the resolution which served as a program for the Kronstadt movement. This is the Petropavlovsk resolution, which is on this channel. We reproduce it in full because of its immense historical importance. It was adopted on February 28th by the sailors of the battleship Petropavlovsk, and was subsequently accepted by all the sailors, soldiers, and workers of Kronstadt. Quote, after having heard the representatives delegated by the general meeting of ship's crew to report on the situation in Petrograd, this assembly takes the following decisions. 1. Seeing that the present Soviets do not express the wishes of the workers and peasants, to organize immediately re-elections to the Soviets of the secret vote, and with care to organize free electoral propaganda for all workers and peasants. 2. To grant liberty of speech and of press to the workers and peasants, to the anarchist and left socialist parties. 3. To secure freedom of assembly for labor unions and peasant organizations. 4. To call a non-partisan conference of the workers, Red Army soldiers, and the sailors of Petrograd, Kronstadt, and of Petrograd province no later than the 10th of March, 1921. 5. To liberate all political prisoners of socialist parties as well as all workers, peasant soldiers and sailors imprisoned in connection with the labor and peasant movements. 6. To elect a commission to review the cases of those held in prisons and concentration camps. 7. To abolish all politodeli, which is, according to this footnote, political sections of the Communist Party existing in the majority of the state institutions. 7. To abolish all politodeli, because no party should be given special privileges in the propagation of its ideas or receive financial support from the government for such purposes. Instead, there should be established educational and cultural commissions, locally elected and financed by the government. 8. To abolish immediately all Zagria Ditelnia Ontriadi. Footnote. Police detachments officially created a struggle against speculation, but which actually used to confiscate everything that the starving population, the workers included, brought from the country for their own personal consumption. End footnote. 9. To equalize all the rations of all who work, with the exception of those employed in trades detrimental to health. 10. To abolish the communist fighting detachments in all branches of the army, as well as the communist guards kept on duty in mills and factories. Should such guards or military detachments be found necessary, they are to be appointed in the army from the ranks, and in the factories according to the judgment of the workers. 11. To give the peasants full freedom of action in regard to their land, and also the right to keep cattle on condition that the peasants manage with their own means, that is, without employing hired labor. 12. To request all branches of the army, as well as our comrades, the military Kursanti, to concur in our resolutions. Footnote. Cadet officers. End footnote. 13. To demand that the press give the fullest publicity to our resolutions. 14. To appoint a traveling commission of control. 15. To permit free artisan production which does not employ hired labor. End quote. End of the Petropavlovsk resolution. These are primitive formulations, insufficient no doubt, but all of them impregnated with the spirit of October, and no calumny in the world can cast a doubt on the immediate connection existing between this resolution and the sentiments which guided the expropriations of 1917. The depth of principle which animates this resolution is shown by the fact that it is still to a great extent applicable. One can, in fact, oppose it as well to the Stalin regime of 1938 as to that of Lenin in 1921. More even than that, the accusations of Trotsky himself against Stalin's regime are only reproductions, timid reproductions, it is true, of the Kronstadt claims. Besides, what other program which is at all socialist could be set up against the bureaucratic oligarchy except that of Kronstadt and the workers' opposition? The appearance of this resolution demonstrates the close connection which existed between the movements of Petrograd and Kronstadt. Trotsky's attempt to set the workers of Petrograd against those of Kronstadt in order to confirm the legend of the counter-revolutionary nature of the Kronstadt movement comes back on Trotsky himself. In 1921, Trotsky pleaded the necessity under which Lenin was situated in justification of the suppression of democracy in the Soviets and in the party, and accused the masses inside and outside the party of sympathizing with Kronstadt. Trotsky admitted, therefore, that at that time, the Petrograd workers and the opposition, although they had not resisted by force of arms, nonetheless extended their sympathy to Kronstadt. Trotsky's subsequent assertion that, quote, the insurrection was inspired by the desire to obtain a privileged ration, end quote, is still more wild. Thus, it is one of these privileged people of the Kremlin, the rations for whom very much better than those of the others, who dares to hurl a similar reproach, and that at the very man who in paragraph 9 of their resolution explicitly demanded equalization of rations. This detail shows the desperate extent of Trotsky's bureaucratic blindness. Trotsky's articles do not depart in the slightest degree from the legend created long ago by the Central Committee of the party. Trotsky certainly deserves credit for the international working class for having refused since 1928 to continue to participate in the bureaucratic degeneration and in the quote new purges, end quote, which were destined to deprive the revolution of all its left-wing elements. Trotsky deserves still more to be defended against Stalin's calumny and assassins. But all this does not give Trotsky the right to insult the working masses of 1921. On the contrary, more than anyone else, Trotsky should furnish a new appreciation of the initiative taken at Kronstadt, an initiative of great historic value, an initiative taken by rank-and-file militants in the struggle against the first blood-stained, quote, purge, end quote, undertaken by the bureaucracy. The attitude of the Russian workers during the tragic winter of 1920-21 shows a profound social instinct, and a noble heroism inspired the working classes of Russia, nor only at the height of the revolution, but also the crisis which placed it in mortal danger. Neither the Kronstadt fighters, nor the Petrograd workers, nor the ranks of the communists could summon, it is true, in that winter the same revolutionary energy as in 1917 to 1919. But what there was of socialism and revolutionary feeling in the Russia of 1921 was possessed by the rank and file. In their opposition to this, Lenin and Trotsky, in line with Stalin, with Zinoviev, Kaganovich, and others, responded to the wishes and served the interests of the bureaucratic cadres. The workers struggled for the socialism which the bureaucracy were already in the process of liquidating. That is the fundamental point of the whole problem. New section. Kronstadt and the NEP. People often believe that Kronstadt forced the introduction of the new economic policy, a profound error. The Kronstadt resolution pronounced in favor of the defense of the workers not only against the bureaucratic capitalism of the state, but also against the restoration of private capitalism. This restoration was demanded in opposition to Kronstadt by the Social Democrats, who combined it with a regime of political democracy. And it was Lenin and Trotsky who to a great extent realized it. but without political democracy, in the form of the NEP, the New Economic Policy. The Kronstadt Resolution declared for the opposite, since the Kronstadt Resolution declared itself against the employment of wage labor in agriculture and small industry. This resolution, and the movement underlying, sought for a revolutionary alliance of the proletarian and peasant workers with the poorest sections of the country laborers, in order that the revolution might develop towards socialism. The NEP, on the other hand, was a union of bureaucrats of the upper layers of the village against the proletariat. The NEP was the alliance of state capitalism and private capitalism against socialism. The new economic policy is as much opposed to the Kronstadt demands as, for example, the revolutionary socialist program of the vanguard of the European workers for the abolition of the Versailles system. Is opposed to the abrogation of the Treaty of Versailles achieved by Hitler. Let us consider, finally, one last accusation which is commonly circulated. That action such as that of Kronstadt could have indirectly let loose the forces of the counter-revolution. It is possible, indeed, that even by placing itself on a footing of workers' democracy, the revolution might have been overthrown. But what is certain is that it has perished, and that it has perished on account of the policy of its leaders. The repression of Kronstadt, the suppression of the democracy of workers and the Soviets by the Russian Communist Party, the elimination of the proletariat from the management of industry, and the introduction of the new economic policy, already signified the death of the revolution. It was precisely the end of the Civil War which produced the splitting of the post-revolutionary society into two fundamental groupings, the working masses and the bureaucracy. As far as its socialist and internationalist aspirations were concerned, the Russian Revolution was stifled. In its nationalist, bureaucratic, and state capitalist tendencies, it developed and consolidated itself. It is from this point onwards, and on this basis, each year more and more clearly, that the Bolshevik repudiation of morality, so frequently evoked, took on a development which had to lead to the Moscow trials. The implacable logic of things has manifested itself. While the revolutionaries, remaining such only in words, accomplished in fact the task of the reaction and counter-revolution, they were compelled, inevitably, to have recourse to lies, to calumny and falsification. This system of generalized lying is the result, not the cause, of the separation of the Bolshevik Party from socialism and from the proletariat. In order to corroborate this statement, I shall quote the testimony regarding Kronstadt of men I have met in Soviet Russia. Quote, "The men of Kronstadt, they were absolutely right. They intervened in order to defend the Petrograd workers. It was a tragic misunderstanding on the part of Lenin and Trotsky, that instead of agreeing with them, they gave them battle," end quote, said DCH to me in 1932. He was a non-party worker in Petrograd in 1921, whom I knew in the political isolator at Verkhenuralsk as a Trotskyist. Quote, "It is a myth that, from the social point of view, Kronstadt of 1921 had a wholly different population from that of 1917, quote, end quote. Another man from Petrograd, DV, said to me in prison, in 1921, DV was a member of the Communist Youth and was imprisoned in 1932 as a, quote, desist, end quote, a member of Sopranov's group of, quote, democratic centralists, end quote. I also had the opportunity of knowing one of the most effective participants in the Kronstadt rebellion. He was an old marine engineer, a communist since 1917, who had, during the Civil War, taken an active part, directing at one time a Cheka in a province somewhere in the Volga, on the Volga, and found himself in 1921 at Kronstadt as a political commissar of the warship Marat, ex-Petropavlovsk. Now that right there is important to speak of the Russian Revolution. I've heard this before. I think it was someone who I don't really particularly agree with. He's one of those. I think he might be around like. It's like one of those kind of like French Marxist philosophers who like you don't really know what they're about, but he's also like a historian. I can't fucking name, but I think he's like kind of like around the milieu of like Lancière and Alain Badiou, who are kind of like, you know, quasi-spiritual, populist, Maoist kind of types. Maybe that's unfair of Lancière, but it's definitely not unfair of Alain Badiou. I can't remember his name. What the fuck? I don't have my computer with me. I can't look it up. But I think it's called The People's History. I think it's from A People's History of the French Revolution. And I can't remember his name, but Marat was like the guy who he was like a journalist who like denounced a bunch of people as like speculators or counter-revolutionaries or something like that. And he was eventually he spent a lot of time in his tub because he was very sick, and he was eventually assassinated in his tub by some woman. But the was it David? I can't remember who painted it, but it was like The Death of Marat. It's a very famous painting of Marat dead in his bathtub. And I remember reading that book and remembering that they said the Kronstadt sailors renamed their ship after Marat. I think I can't remember what his journal was called. It was like something like the Voice of the People, or the People's Tribune, or something like that. Eric Hazan, that's the guy's name. That's the author's name, Eric Hazan. And it's weird that I remember that, because I was like, I think I read that around the time that Trump was elected president. So I'm impressed with myself that I remember that, but I've heard this before, that they named their ship after Marat. There's probably better people they could have named their ship after, but it goes to show that they were at the very least not hostile to the stated ambitions of the Russian Revolution. They were kind of like, it's interesting because it's like, on the one hand, I guess like everybody has their own interpretation of like, I guess different people have their own like interpretations of Bolshevism, and a lot of people think that the core of Bolshevism was like the slogan of all power to the Soviets, which I would disagree with. But I think for the Kronstadt sailors, they were kind of like, okay, we fought this revolution on the grounds that we were going to have a socialist democracy based on Soviet power, and what we've got is like one-party rule with the economy based on forcing grain out of the peasants at gunpoint, and the development of bureaucratic inequalities, and so on and so forth. And that they're kind of like a lot of people say like they're like their attempt was like the realization of October, not like a new kind of revolution that was like hostile to the October. It seems like to a large extent they viewed themselves in a degree as the rightful inheritors of what the ostensible Bolshevik project was, but that that project had been betrayed. So I don't know, just thinking out loud, but I have heard that they renamed the Petropavlov. I didn't know I didn't know that they renamed the Petropavlovs the Marat. I knew they named a ship, an important ship in their fleet, the Marat. Anyway, when I, Ante Ciliga, saw, what was his name again? I don't think they gave a name for him. It just says one of the most effective participants in the Kronstadt rebellion. Well, let me just reread the whole paragraph because I've been talking for a while. It's only a couple sentences. I also had the opportunity of knowing one of the most effective participants in the Kronstadt rebellion. He was an old marine engineer, a communist since 1917, who had, during the Civil War, taken an active part, directing at one time a Cheka in a province somewhere on the Volga, and found himself in 1921 at Kronstadt as a political commissar on the warship Marat, ex-Petropavlovsk. When I saw him in 1930 in the Leningrad prison, he had just spent the previous 8 years in the Vitsky Islands. We didn't know Leningrad was the name they gave to Petrograd, eventually. Which I always get all the cities confused. So if I might have just told you something untrue, because I get confused so much. But I always get confused about what cities become what. New section: the methods of struggle. The Kronstadt workers pursued revolutionary aims in struggling against the reactionary tendencies of the bureaucracy, and they used clean and honest methods. In contrast, the bureaucracy slandered their movement odiously, pretending that it was led by General Kozlovsky. Actually, the men of Kronstadt honestly desired as comrades to discuss the questions at issue with the representatives of the government. I believe Emma Goldman tried to arrange that. I believe that was like what I believe was Alexander Berkman. I believe was also in the state at the time, but that was one of their things that they tried. They felt that their position, what they should do in response to the Kronstadt uprising was to try to prevent the dispute from becoming a bloodbath by organizing, opening up communication pathways between Kronstadt and the Bolshevik government. I believe that's the case, at least. So, the Kronstadt workers' action had at first a defensive character. That is the reason why they did not occupy Oranienbaum in time, situated on the coast opposite Kronstadt. Right from the start, the Petrograd bureaucrats made use of the system of hostages by arresting the families of the sailors. Red Army soldiers and workers of Kronstadt who were living in Petrograd because several commissars in Kronstadt, not one of whom was shot, had been arrested. The news of the seizing of hostages was brought to the knowledge of Kronstadt by means of leaflets dropped from airplanes. In their reply by radio, Kronstadt declared on March 7th, quote, that they did not wish to imitate Petrograd, as they considered that such an act, even when carried out in an excess of desperation and hate, is most shameful and most cowardly from every point of view. History has not yet known a similar procedure, end quote. Izvestia. News of the Revolutionary Committee of Kronstadt, 7th of March, 1921. The new governing clique understood much better than the Kronstadt, quote, rebels, end quote, the significance of the social struggle which was beginning, the depth of the class antagonism which separated it from the workers. It was in this that lies of the tragedy of revolutions in the period of their decline. It is in this that lies the tragedy of revolutions in the period of their decline. But while military conflict was forced upon Kronstadt, they still found the strength to formulate the program for the, quote, Third Revolution, end quote, which remains, since then, the program of the Russian socialism of the future. Footnote: a comprehensive work on Kronstadt, containing the essential documents on these historic days, has just been compiled by Idemet. Idemet's publication should supply, in my opinion, a timely contribution to the international discussion which is now developing. I have that piece, that document on the channel. It has very few views, so you should check it out. It's what's the word? Its analytics are low, and they don't deserve to be. It's a very, very good book. Next section, final section as well. Balance sheet. There are reasons for thinking that, granted the relations between the forces of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, of socialism and capitalism, which existed in Russia and Europe at the beginning of 1921, the struggle for the socialist development of the Russian Revolution was doomed to defeat. In those conditions, the socialist program of the masses could not conquer. It had to depend on the triumph of the counter-revolution, whether openly declared or camouflaged under an aspect of degeneracy, as has been produced in fact. But such a conception of the progress of the Russian Revolution does not diminish in the slightest, in the realms of principle, the historic importance of the program and the efforts of the working masses. On the contrary, this program constitutes the point of departure from which a new cycle in the revolutionary socialist development will begin. In fact, each new revolution begins not on the basis from which the preceding one started, but from the point at which the revolution before it had undergone a moral setback. The experience of the degeneration of the Russian Revolution places anew before the conscience of international socialism an extremely important sociological problem. In the Russian Revolution, as in two other great revolutions, those of England and of France, why is it that it is from the inside that the counter-revolution is triumphed? At the moment when the revolutionary forces were exhausted, and by means of the revolutionary party itself, quote, purged, end quote, it is true of its left-wing elements. Marxism believes that the socialist revolution, once begun, would either be assured of a gradual and continued development toward integral socialism, or would be defeated through the agency of bourgeois restoration. Altogether, the Russian Revolution poses in an entirely new way the problem of the mechanism of the socialist revolution. This question must become paramount in international discussion. In such discussion, the problem of Kronstadt can and must have a position worthy of it. The end. Thanks for listening.